Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tim Green. I'm the most recent past president of the Renewable Energy Working Group, and we are here to do a webinar talking about the intersection of climate change, renewable energy, and wildlife. And we have three presenters today. Our three presenters are Michael Whitby, Michael Fishman, and Susan Rupp. And just some background on things on what we'd like to do. Questions, we're going to do the three presentations up front, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers. And if you would put your questions within the Q&A, and you can find the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and address your questions to the individual speakers. And to facilitate you not having to write out names, if you'll use MW for Michael Whitby, MF for Michael Fishman, and SR for Susan Rupp. That will allow us to read your questions and direct them to the right person. And so we can get as many questions answered as possible. We are on an hour time frame, so we will try to finish as close to 3 p.m. Or 4 p.m. Eastern time as possible. So a quick introduction of our speakers with their bios. Our first speaker is going to be Michael Whitby, and Michael is the director of the Bats and Wind Energy Program at the Bat Conservation International, and he focuses on research to describe and minimize bat fatalities and wind energy facilities. Michael has 13 years of experience working on bat conservation in academic, public, and private settings in North America. He has studied bat distributions and behavior with acoustic and capture techniques, radio telemetry, thermal imaging, next-rad radar, among other things. He holds a BS from the University of Maine and an MS from Ball State University, and is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. His dissertation is work examines the spatial and temporal distribution of bat activity across the landscape using acoustic detectors and X-rad radar. Our second speaker is Michael Fishman. Michael is a certified wildlife biologist. He is a professional wetland scientist, although that professional has lapsed a little bit. He still does a lot of wetland science work. And he is the co-founder, co-owner of Edgewood Environmental Consulting, LLC. He holds a BS degree in natural resources, wildlife and aquatic sciences from Cornell University. He has an MS degree in conservation biology from the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. And he has worked in natural resource consulting and biodiversity management for more than 25 years. And for more than 25 years of his 30-year career, he has been working with renewable energy developers, mostly in solar and wind, but has also done some biomass and hydro work to minimize adverse impacts to natural resources and biodiversity. So while seeking opportunities to augment ecosystem services. And then our third speaker today is Susan Rupp. She is a certified wildlife biologist and CEO of Enviroscapes Ecological Consulting, LLC, based in Gravette, Arkansas. She double majored in wildlife biology and biology with a minor in Spanish at Colorado State University. She received her MS and PhD at Texas Tech University. I won't put that against her because I'm from A&M. She's doing research on elk in north central New Mexico, where she also worked for Los Alamos National Laboratory and New Mexico Game and Fish for a period of time. Since 2006, her research has focused on sustainable bioenergy development and the potential impacts to wildlife and wildlife habitat. She was nominated as one of 2 environmental experts by the U.S. Secretaries of Agriculture and Energy in 2017 to serve a 3-year term on the Biomass Research Development Technical Advisory Committee. This is a group that provided technical and fiscal oversight for the Biomass Board, which was comprised of senior officials within the U.S. government. She is also an affiliated member of Lee Enterprises Consulting, the world's largest bioeconomy consulting group, where she serves as a project leader on land, natural resources, and management issues. So this is, again, this is the intersection of climate and solar energy. And we're proud to be here. And from what I understand, this is the largest, so far, the largest attendance for the TWS webinars. So Michael Whitby, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tim. I'm here today to present a case study about wind energy and how it affects biodiversity, specifically here in North America, and kind of what we're hopefully doing about it. Before I continue, I would like to acknowledge this work was not done alone. The second half, or the last few slides of this talk, are work done by Bat Conservation International's chief scientist, Dr. Winifred Frick. And of course, there was other co-authors as well, including Manuela Huso and Dr. Chris Hine at the National Renewable Energy Lab. In North America, we've been concerned about bat fatalities at wind energy facilities since around 2004. And curtailment, which is essentially slowing down or stopping the spinning of wind turbine blades, was first identified as a research priority in 2008. And studies quickly followed that time. In 2013, these were summarized in a qualitative manner, and it was guesstimated, I guess you could say, that increasing the cut-in speed by 1.5 to 3 meters per second could reduce bat fatalities by 50%. However, there's been some questions about this, and because that was 2013 and it's almost a decade later, we had the idea to summarize more completely what has been done since 2008 and what we know about operational minimization or curtailment. I might interchange those terms. Just as a note, they mean the same thing. However, the language has evolved back and forth of what's the most accepted way, so I sometimes interchange them. So most studies show a reduction in fatalities. You can see here in this chart, it's kind of hard to discern what is happening though. Even though there's always a reduction in fatalities, which is shown on the y-axis here, the higher on that y-axis, the greater the reduction, so the better for bats. The uncertainty is shown by your lines, the vertical lines, if they are even reported, which the dots without the lines have unreported uncertainty. Most of that uncertainty comes from few turbines in a treatment and low numbers of fatalities, less than 10. It's often single digits that we're looking at reducing from 8 to 4 or 5 to 2. So that leads to a lot of uncertainty in these studies. There's also a great amount of variability that makes this sort of graph and modeling difficult. These turbines in these studies have different makes and models, which means they have different original cut-in speed, which is the speed at which they begin generating electricity. It's not necessarily whether or not they are spinning. That's whether or not they are spinning is more determined by whether the blades are feathered or not. This feathering is when the blades are rotated 90 degrees parallel to the wind so that they don't catch the wind. A turbine can be spinning when it's not generating electricity, especially if the blades are not feathered. And so this can have a great impact on what fatality reduction is observed. And then, of course, study design can have different aspects. So when looking at this graph, we do see that it's likely that on the x-axis there, that of raising the cut-in speed likely does lead to increasing benefits for bat species. However, especially on that lower end, we have a hard time seeing by how much. And so to address these questions, we began a quantitative meta-analysis, which goes through the process of a primary literature search, extracting and calculating effect sizes, testing for heterogeneity, which is essentially differences between the studies, and then explaining that those differences with meta-regression. And then we can, of course, predict the effect size under specific conditions. Our literature search identified 15 control treatment comparisons at 8 facilities. We can see here some of them did have species-specific results that that I will show later. These were also primarily located in the U.S. Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic regions. However, there were also some from Texas and Alberta that could be included. For total bat fatalities, we see that for the most part, all the studies all report a fatality reduction. There is one study that shows an increase in fatalities. That is indicated by the dot being to the left of the dotted line in this forest plot. However, that was a year with, I think the treatment had 1 or 2 fatalities and the control had 0. It was a very low fatality year at that one site. However, the vast majority of studies show a decrease in fatalities, and many of the confidence intervals of the effect size don't even cross 0. That is only the confidence intervals only cross 0 for a handful. But there is heterogeneity. We see similar things for hoary bats. However, because we get into lower and lower fatalities and effect sizes, we have much more uncertainty. Again, for eastern red bats and silverhair bats, these 3 species represent about 70 to 75% of fatalities at wind energy facilities, and therefore are the species that we could analyze because they actually had enough studies with fatalities in them. We modeled various hypotheses of what could affect the heterogeneity among the studies. And for time's sake, I won't get into each one of these. However, we show that treatment cut-in speed was the most reliable model, simply accounting for treatment cut-in speed far outweighed using additional variables. Additionally, variables that took into account turbine characteristics, study design, and geographic variation, all were actually ranked lower than the null model, which showed that operational minimization or curtailment is a pretty universal solution to reduce bat fatalities. When the cut-in speed is increased by 1 meter per second, we can expect approximately a 33% reduction in total bat fatalities. That varies slightly with individual species. However, we can see here that it's still around that 30% mark for each species with every meter per second increase. And that is an additive linear effect. Just all of these graphs are what is presented is on the left where we scale to a percentage. However, if you leave it on the log ratio of the means, you see that that's a linear effect. So for every meter per second, you reduce the bat fatalities by an additional 33%. What could that mean for bats if implemented? A standard cut-in speed is 5 meters per second. It's often used as a metric and suggested for reducing bat fatalities. We can expect anywhere from a 50 to 60% for reduction in bat fatalities for individual species, and a 62% reduction in total bat fatalities if a 5 meter per second cut speed was used. If that was increased to 6.5 meters per second, you could expect almost 80% reduction in total bat fatalities and around a 70 to 75% in individual species. So the next question is kind of, is this really needed? So this gets into the work of Dr. Frick and colleague Nick Friedenberg, who looked at assessing the fatality of minimization in hoary bats. This was published just earlier this year. And essentially, its previous work has shown that hoary bats are at risk of extinction due to wind energy development. And so this newer work really looked at how, if certain reductions could help prevent the extinction of the hoary bat. We're going to look specifically at the abundance in the if the hoary bat abundance is in the 2.25 to 4 million range, which is the most likely range identified by experts in an expert elicitation. And in order to prevent a 50% decline in hoary bats by 2050, you would need anywhere from 35 to 100% with minimal wind energy development. However, if the high build-out scenario of rapid wind energy development, which seems most likely, were to occur, you would need somewhere on the range of 66 to 100% reduction in hoary bat fatalities if the population was 2.25 million. Of course, that does reduce somewhere on to the 38 to 98% range if the population is higher at 4 million. So kind of, you can see that these ranges in that 66 to 100 or 38 to 98% is what is achievable with operational minimization. The meta-analysis showed a reduction in the 63 to 65% range with raising the cut-in speed to 5 meters per second. So kind of in conclusion, there's strong evidence that curtailment is effective at reducing bat fatalities. And the modeling and population viability analysis shows an urgent need to reduce fatalities to prevent that 50% decline in hoary bats, and that this is achievable with operational minimization. However, there is a cost to raising the cut-in speed. As I mentioned, the cut-in speed is the speed at which electricity is generated, and that is clean, green, clean energy that can help in our fight against climate change. And therefore, reducing the cost and increasing the amount of electricity that can be generated is extremely important. And so in the future, we can continue to refine curtailment to be implemented at times that are most at risk, most risky for bats to be there, and hopefully increase electricity generation while maintaining the fatality reduction that is important for the longevity of bat species. And with that, I think I stayed under my 15 minutes. I told Tim I'd have to rush through. So I'm glad he didn't have to kick me off. And thank you. And I'll definitely try to answer everybody's questions when we get to it.
Okay, thanks, Michael. we're going to now transition over to Michael Fishman, who will be talking to us about solar. And let me get to the share screen. Okay, Michael, you're up.
Okay, thank you, Tim. We're going to shift gears now to solar energy, another form of renewable energy, and some of the issues we address with solar energy with regard to environmental impacts, in particular impacts to wildlife, and how we're trying to resolve some of those impacts nowadays. Next slide, Tim. So as I think we all know and recognize, climate change progression is changing ecosystems. It's been very widely recognized throughout the literature, throughout the world, seeing droughts and changes in vegetation compositions, shifts in natural ranges of various wildlife species, flooding in some areas, expecting sea level rise. So there are a lot of changes going on that are altering natural ecosystems and natural habitats that, of course, are impacting wildlife. Tim, next. Obviously, conversion from fossil fuels to non-greenhouse gas emitting energy sources is a very important part of the effort to reduce and reverse climate change. There will be other parts of that as well that probably need to be implemented that may even be harder to implement, things like encouraging people to conserve energy. But certainly the switch from high emissions and greenhouse gas emissions energy sources is a major player in this. And the logical source to switch to, of course, are various renewable energy sources. Next. However, renewable energy development, while it sounds like the end-all be-all and the ultimate solution to this problem, doesn't come without its own environmental costs. There are, particularly solar energy, requires more landscape, more real estate per megawatt hour generated than any other energy form. In the fact that you've got to cover the ground, and if you're using solar photovoltaic cells, they cover a lot of area. They require a lot of land mass, and they need to be, at least currently, located near points of interconnect or potential points of interconnect, and therefore are limited in where they can be located on the landscape. And this creates a number of different issues. It requires sometimes use of lands that might better be used in other ways, but there are some solutions that have been tried. Next, Tim. A big one, I'm from central New York, and in New York, we are in the middle of a big solar boom here, and one of the solutions that is being pursued is developing farmland, converting farmland to solar fields. This is a very logical use of the land. The land is previously cleared, so there's minimal vegetation clearing to be done. The downside is, of course, we're losing some highly productive farmlands in many cases. And that is a concern to the Department of Ag and Markets in the state. It's a concern to agrarian communities that want to maintain their community character. Some of the other solutions that are put forth, of course, are putting them on existing structures or putting them over existing developed areas. For example, using parking lots and creating parking lot shades on which panels are installed. The New York State Department of Environmental Conservation has, in fact, created some incentives to develop sites like brownfields and wastewater treatment plant sites with solar by minimizing and eliminating, in some cases, the state environmental quality review requirements for developing such areas, which helps to sort of grease the skids in getting approvals through. Tim, next. But in most cases, or at least in many cases, solar development still does require some form of habitat conversion. And that habitat conversion generally or very often yields a loss of biodiversity on a site. When you're changing vegetation communities, even from a simple existing early successional old field, and then creating a site that looks like one of these, the top picture there is in the Northeast. And a lot of fields, I just drove through Massachusetts this past weekend, and most of the fields we saw in Massachusetts are all turf grass fields underneath the panels. If you go out west to more desert-like states where vegetation really can't be supported, you very often get bare soil areas beneath the panels. And so it minimizes the amount of biodiversity. It changes dramatically what the potential habitat is for wildlife, to support wildlife when these sites are developed. Next. One solution that's been put forth, particularly in the North and Midwest, we're seeing this quite a bit, is that when solar fields are developed, they are planted as pollinator meadows. And there are various incentives for doing this. There are regulatory incentives in some cases. There are pollinator scorecards developed by Purdue University and various other organizations that recognize that, nice, diverse native seed mixes can benefit an area by increasing biodiversity of insects, which can have a trophic cascade up to support more bird species and other things that will feed on the insects. However, there's still some issues with that, in that trying to get seed mixes that are genuinely locally native or even regionally appropriate can be very difficult. Very often the pollinators that are encouraged on some of these sites don't necessarily pollinate other species in the area. And in some cases, I have worked with some ecologists who suggest that we might be better off trying to encourage pollinators, but also encouraging, for example, things like crop pest predators, insects that will prey on crop pests, particularly if we're developing in farmland communities. And we've done some work with that as well on some sites. Tim, next. But there is a movement, and it's really a global movement. It was originated in Britain to develop an ecosystem-wide management approach to solar park development. Here in the US, we tend to refer to large solar developments as solar farms. In Britain, they call them solar parks. But they've developed, a group of folks in Great Britain led by Alana Armstrong, developed a system called the Solar Park Impacts on Ecosystem Services, or SPIES model. And the SPIES model is based on an overall and kind of overarching view of designing solar parks to benefit and to augment ecosystem services, a wide array of ecosystem services. Those include wildlife habitat and biodiversity, but they also include things like water, air quality, can include food production, can include cultural values and things like that. But the system that was developed, I would encourage you to visit the SPIES website. However, unfortunately, I visited it a couple of days ago just to kind of check up on some things, and discovered that it's been hacked and currently has lots of information on how to find good escorts in Dubai, but not a lot of information on the project itself. So I'm hoping that they will repair that, but it is a very worthwhile website to visit once it's back up online. But it contains an interactive tool to identify solar park ecosystem management prescriptions to enhance ecosystem services. And each one of the prescriptions that are described in the tool are supported by peer-reviewed literature. Next. And so earlier this year, I collaborated with a team of people from Working Lands Investment Partners, a group of very, very talented people, ecologists, economists, and folks involved in various realms of natural resource management to develop kind of our own brand of this system, which we called the Solar Ecosystem Enhancement Tool. It's made right here in the USA, and it was targeted, our first 3 trial sites were in Ohio, Indiana, and Oregon. And we also developed a fairly similar interactive tool to identify solar ecosystem management prescriptions. It was supported by 67 peer-reviewed articles that were plugged in for various management prescriptions and how they might affect ecosystem services. Next, Tim. And are based on the ecosystem services that are outlined and described in much more detail in the Millennium Ecosystems Assessment. For those not familiar with this, or perhaps for people as old, if not older than I am, ecosystem services are what we used to call functions and values for the most part. But between 2001 and 2005, a group of about 1,200 scientists globally conducted what was called the Millennium Ecosystems Assessment. Yielded a 6-volume set of books describing all sorts of ecosystem services that were divided into 4 categories. The first being provisioning services. The provisioning services include things that provide a needed resource. Simple things like food, water, cover, the basic needs of any wildlife species. Then there are regulating services, which help to stabilize or moderate processes. A stabilizing service might include shade that helps to thermally regulate ground temperatures, or vegetation that helps to support soil structure. Then there are cultural services, which of course support human culture, values, recreation, beliefs, things of that nature. And finally, supporting services, which support processes and functions. That pretty much describes those. Next. So the goal of our model was basically to figure out how to restore or replace ecosystem services as appropriate on proposed solar parks. And we came up with a three-tiered approach. The lowest tier, tier 1, was basically just to build a stabilized site. Would have probably fairly minimal ecosystem service addition, but was to hopefully maintain the ecosystem services on the site, or at least balance them. The second tier usually included more vegetative cover, perhaps with restored or maintained habitats on the site, to restore or replace ecosystem services that might be impacted by the development of the solar field. And finally, tier 3 was to restore or create habitats with enhanced ecosystem services. That was, we wanted the balance of ecosystem services post-construction to be greater than the ecosystem services exhibited by the site pre-construction. That's a relatively rare thing. It's a relatively difficult thing because, quite frankly, it's a relatively expensive thing. And energy companies are not in the business of providing a wide array of ecosystem services or restoring habitats necessarily. They're in the business of generating energy. And they have to be able to generate enough energy to make enough money to do all of these other things. So if there is not a regulatory driver behind tier 3 level management, it's probably not going to happen an awful lot. We hope to get at least to tier 2. And if we can, or if there are other driving factors like rare species or protected habitats, then those might very well drive the system to tier 3. Next, Tim. So this is a simplified flow chart of how the system works. I'm going to kind of blow through this fairly quickly because I don't want to run too far over time here. Start up in the upper left corner. Is there a natural cover type? We start with a basic assessment, and this is part of any environmental review of any prospective solar development site. Is there a natural cover ecotype on the parcel? If there isn't, if it's a pre-developed parcel, if it's a previously disturbed parcel, then the question has to be asked, well, can any habitat be created that might help to support wildlife or create habitat for wildlife? If not, then we're probably looking at a situation like a brownfield development or landfill or parking lot, rooftop, those structures. In some cases, there can still be enhancements that can be added, structures that can be added. I have done wildlife management on the roof of office buildings in downtown Chicago. So it is possible to do these things. But for the most part, those tend to get relegated to the tier 1 sites, sites where there's limited opportunity even to develop habitat or to develop ecosystem services further. If there are natural cover types on the site, however, we assess the existing ecosystem services, and this becomes a feedback loop. When we're done and we get to any one of these tiers, we then reassess those to compare and contrast and see, have we made any increases in ecosystem services? Have we augmented ecosystem services? Or are we providing ecosystem services that weren't previously provided, for example? And that brings us down to the yellow, which is tier 2. Are there protected resources? We have to consider that. If there are protected resources, things like wetlands, rare cover types, rare threatened or endangered species on the site. Of course, if there are, we drop down, you avoid and minimize impacts to the extent possible. But when it comes to the third level of sequencing and you get to mitigation, that's where we can, again, plug in the solar ecosystem enhancement tool and say what cover types and features can enhance the ecosystem services on the site to manage for those and to maintain them on the site, or even if we can maintain them adjacent to the site. Going back up to the yellow, what cover types and features can maintain ecosystem services? That's the next question we ask if there are no protected resources. And finally, we can do things like we can certainly create habitats, restore habitats on site to an extent. You do run into issues. A lot of folks say that, well, we're creating grasslands. Well, we are, but we're not. Yes, we're returning most of these sites to early successional stages, but because there are structures that cross the sites, they're not really considered open early successional habitats. They don't provide the open land that many grassland songbirds, for example, require. Even something like a sedge wren, which only requires about a 2-acre patch of open grasslands, isn't going to find a 2-acre open patch in a fenced solar field. The panels are too densely packed for that. But we can do things like wildlife fencing to allow small mammals and herptiles to get in and out of the fence. We can do, of course, pollinator plantings and encourage crop pest predator plantings, avian perches and bat boxes, puddling and nesting sites, community gardens and trails for cultural ecosystem services, which can bring us to tier 2. We can also look at habitats that are within the fence that might be regulated and will be protected, things like a stream crossing a corner of a site, and provide buffers for that stream to protect the quality, to protect the water quality, to keep it shaded without shading the panels. And those can be effective means of managing the sites for ecosystem service benefits. Going back down to the green at the bottom, we're looking then at habitat restoration and creation on a site or possibly off-site adjacent to the site. Long-term monitoring. I'm currently working with a site in northeastern New York where there were 3 listed grassland bird species occupying a proposed solar development site. So we purchased up land adjacent to that, and we'll be managing that land for 20 years with periodic and rotational mowing to maintain it in an early successional stage. And we'll be monitoring that to see how those bird species are using that area for that 20-year period. And that's, I think, a tremendous need in this field, is to look much more in depth at how wildlife are using solar sites and areas adjacent to solar sites to see what other potential wildlife benefits we can find for developing solar sites. Tim, next. So we use these, the tool to develop plans. And we came up with these solar ecosystem enhancement plans, which can include recommendations for prescriptions for tiers 1, 2, and or 3. It depends on what the regulatory requirements are. It depends on what needs there are. It depends on what resources are available to be able to promote these. And that's been our final product. We're still in the testing of this. But it seems to show a lot of promise, and I look forward to coming back, hopefully, and presenting some findings as we move on with this. And be happy to take questions later.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Our next speaker is Susan Rupp. She will be talking on biomass. If I can get the slides to advance.
Yeah, thanks,
There
Tim. I'm going to try, I only have 13 slides, and I'm going to try to go through them rather quickly so that we do have time to answer some questions here at the end. What I want to talk about today is actually a national effort that's called the Bioeconomy Development Opportunity Zone Program, and whether or not this could be considered an opportunity or not for wildlife. A lot of what you'll see presented today is actually information that's been structured and compiled by a company in Canada called EcoStrat that's been working with the Department of Energy to develop new financial risk standards for the bioeconomy. But at the end, I'll be talking about opportunities to use the BDO zone program, hopefully to promote wildlife habitat rather than make it detrimental to it. Next slide. So if we look at information that came out of the Energy Information Administration in 2021, you can see that renewable energies, which are really that center portion of the graph here in the orange, yellow, green, and dark green areas, comprise still a relatively small portion of the total world's energy supply. But when we look at those renewables, we can see that biofuels and waste products in the orange there are actually the most, provide the most contribution to the world energy supply in terms of renewables. And this is concerning because when we look at biomass resources, we're talking about a relatively large footprint on the landscape that can have detrimental effects on wildlife and ecosystem services. Next. So what is the Bioeconomy Development Opportunity Zone? It's a program that leverages the Federal Opportunity Zone program, which I'll talk about in just a minute, to immediately unlock billions of dollars of vitally important equity for bioeconomy development across the country. Next. So what is the Federal Opportunity Zone program? The Federal Opportunity Zone program was actually developed by President Trump back in 2017. It was added to the tax code by the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in December of 2017. And what the Opportunity Zone program does is it designates economically distressed communities where new investments under certain conditions can be eligible for preferential tax treatments, specifically capital gains tax relief. So the first opportunity zones were actually designated in April of 2018. They're typically designated by state government officials and then approved by the IRS. Next slide. So for example, the map that you see there on the right is the state of Arkansas where I'm located. Everything in the light and dark blue are federal opportunity zones that were designated by our state governor. Typically these fall in rural areas, but some of them do fall in larger municipalities in areas, specific sections of cities that tend to be a little more economically depressed. And the BDO zone program, the Bioeconomy Development Opportunity Zone program, is a subset of these federal opportunity zones that have three specific attributes. The first is a surplus of biomass. The second is low risk supply chains to deliver the biomass. And finally, a suitable infrastructure to support an operating plant. So in order to qualify for opportunity zone credits or tax relief, project developers have to actually put the facility itself within an opportunity zone, a federal opportunity zone, but they can source the biomass from areas outside of that opportunity zone. Next slide. I mentioned that one of the factors is a low supply chain risk score. One thing that the Department of Energy has recognized for the last several years is that existing algorithms that are used by financial institutions to assess risk really don't work well for the bioeconomy. And this is where EcoStrat came into play. EcoStrat was contracted by the federal government, by Department of Energy, just over 5 years ago to develop new financial risk standards for the bioeconomy. And these risk standards are comprised of 6 different categories with 28 risk factors and 126 separate sub-risk indicators. You can see in the graphic there what some of those indicators are, and really what the indicators do is they assess risk from feedstock development all the way through the supply chain to end use, and then they assign based on those risk indicators a rating to that area. A AA rating would be considered very low risk, and then as you go down to an A rating, a B rating, a C rating, you increase in risk from there. Next slide. So the Bioeconomy Development Opportunity Zone program essentially identifies the subset of the federal opportunity zones that then go through this supply chain risk assessment. And once that's completed and a risk rating is assigned to that specific area, Those BDO zones can be promoted through federal, state, and local economic development organizations, through capital markets, which I'm going to talk about here in just a minute, and through local economies, essentially rural development economies and things like that, to try to promote or market those BDO zone designations. Next slide. And EcoStrat has done a wonderful job here of pulling together some of the world's foremost investment groups in order to support this program. There are over 65 review committee members comprised of groups like Goldman Sachs, Manulife, Citibank, Shell, CAFE, which is promoting sustainable aviation fuel, Forest Service, USDA. You can go online to the website there at the bottom, ecostrat.com/standards/participants to read more about the investment groups that have contributed to the BSCR ratings. Next slide. So coming back to the map I showed you previously of Arkansas, how is this being applied to Northwest Arkansas? Northwest Arkansas, specifically Benton and Washington counties, which is in the dark green in the upper right-hand corner, produce some of the most, we are either the second or third largest poultry producing region in the country. And as a result, we end up with a lot of poultry waste that is then contaminating both our soils and our water table. So what we are doing is looking at the possibility of designating poultry litter as a sustainable feedstock in order to take it out of the system and use it for renewable energy generation, probably the production of natural gas, and then supplement that with the production of native grasses on the landscape that can be used as a co-digestate in an anaerobic digestion process or something like that in order to promote wildlife habitat and improve our water quality in the area. And just recently, mid-October of this year, the city of Siloam Springs, which is there in the red circle, was designated as the second BDO zone in the entire country. So I worked with EcoStrat in order to get the city of Siloam Springs designated. And if you look closely, some of those areas in light blue, especially right across the border in northeast Oklahoma, are also opportunity zones. So the goal here is hopefully to pull together different opportunity zones with a focus on poultry litter as a feedstock so that we can get that litter, that waste stream out of the ecosystem to produce some form of renewable energy while improving ecosystem services and wildlife habitat. Next slide. So this kind of ties into what my company has been really focused on here over the last 5 years, which is a two-pronged approach to poultry house management in Northwest Arkansas and Northeast Oklahoma. And the two prongs specifically are, the first is necessary remediation of old poultry sites. These are non-operational sites, of which we have thousands of them in this part of the country. We want to get those old poultry houses taken down and remediate the soils and replant with native vegetation. And then the second prong is this value innovation approach that I was just talking about, where we can look at operational poultry facilities and find a way to take some of those waste products that are coming off of those facilities and use them for renewable energy generation while also promoting native habitat production around those sites. Next slide. And this is really modeled after a project that I was part of in central Missouri by a company called Raceline Alternative Energy. And what they are doing is they've actually teamed up with Smithfield Foods, the world's largest pork producer, to take the effluent from those swine facilities and instead of spraying that effluent on corn crops or row crops or cool season grass fields, they're replacing a lot of those row crops and cool season grass fields with native prairie, which they're then harvesting as a co-digestate in an anaerobic digestion process to produce compressed and liquefied natural gas that they're then piping directly into the natural gas grid. So they're creating habitat on the landscape, but also using it in the renewable energy generation process. So they're able to see all the benefits of that native prairie production, including increased soil health, air quality, wildlife habitat, water quality, all those things. It's been fantastic to see what they're doing. And the idea is to try to take that model and apply it to poultry litter, which has a whole different set of characteristics in Northwest Arkansas and Northeast Oklahoma. And if you want to go to the website there at the bottom, Raceline Alternative Energy, you can find out more about that. Previous slide, please, Tim. So this really, the idea here, the concept is part of a bigger picture, which is to try to promote something called conservation biomass. And conservation biomass has two specific properties. First, it's biomass that has a profit and ecosystem services intention. So the idea is that we can put native plants on the landscape that are going to improve our ecosystem services, but then harvest those native plants in order to produce renewable energy at the same time. Final slide. So coming back to the initial question of whether this bioeconomy development opportunity zone program is going to be beneficial for wildlife, it all depends. It depends on the type of biomass that's being used and being promoted. And this is why I'm trying to get in at the front end with my company to make sure that we promote the native grass component, the native prairie component, and hopefully show the world that we can do this in a way that has economic benefits, environmental benefits, and social benefits. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. I think we've got about 8 minutes left.
Yes, so we have about 8 minutes left. And before we get to questions, I just want to do quick promotions for the next Wildlife Society webinar. It will be on December 16th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. It will be a discussion on the sustainable forest management and wildlife and the challenges and opportunities. And that webinar will be hosted by the Forestry and Wildlife Working Group. And then the Renewable Energy Working Group will also have a webinar, another webinar in January. And it'll be on our website. It's titled Solar Sierra Club versus Sierra Club. A cautionary case, which will be presented by Karen Swain, January 25th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. And with that, we've got a few questions in our that we have. I guess one initial question is, if curtailment works, how can wind operators be compelled to use it? So this would be for Michael Whitby.
Good question. We've been kind of asking ourselves at BCI that same question. Right now it is mostly voluntary, with the exception of endangered regulations, mostly under the Endangered Species Act and habitat conservation plans associated with that. However, there is implementation of at least feathering is the best management practice by what was the American Wind Energy Association and is now American Clean Power, a trade group. So that's one bonus. And there are companies that are implementing it on a wide scale basis, mostly as part of habitat conservation plans.
Okay. Michael Fishman, if folks can see the Q&A, but put a response to promoting pest and predator species, talking about impacts to birds. Another question for Michael Fishman is, given competitiveness among energy companies and the desire for regulatory fairness among projects, what non-regulatory means would be encouraged would encourage companies to pursue tier 2 or 3 solutions?
That's a very good question, Ted. And I think in some cases there are returns that these companies get from the standpoint of social contract with the communities in which they work. One of the biggest impacts of solar farms really is their visual impact, and a lot of communities object to that. And that can be overcome to some degree if solar farms are creating services that benefit a community, and that can include habitat creation and other ecosystem services. So there is a social license, I guess, that is available to solar farms that do a little bit more than just plunking panels on the ground and planting grass around the bottoms of them. So that is a benefit. And there could be potentially financial reward for that, where it's hard to say where a regulatory incentive versus a, for example, tax incentive could exist. Virtually all of the solar farms negotiate payment in lieu of tax agreements, and I think those could be used as a strong incentive for habitat creation.
Thank you. And a question will transition to Susan. VDO zones will be difficult to establish in places like upstate New York due to the lack of large corporations that can take advantage of the tax credits. We have the forests, many of which have been high graded multiple times to provide the fuel, but not the capital. Under the aegis of the Young Forest Initiative, the value of the wood for lumber would be enhanced by cutting the existing lower grade standing timber, which simultaneously would benefit early successional species. So just more of a comment than a question, but maybe you can comment on that, Susan.
Yeah, definitely. This is one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in the last several years with regard to the use of woody materials, is that I think there's a lot of interest in using some of the woody waste materials or areas that need to be thinned for fire suppression or things like that. The problem is when we start getting into how feedstocks are tracked and traced in order to qualify for certain credits like RINs, it gets to be very, very complicated. So there are a lot of people that have much higher pay grade than me working on those sorts of issues to try to see how we can most efficiently acquire and use those materials efficiently.
Okay, thank you. Question or comment for Michael Fishman. Will your grassland bird study at the New York site include monitoring the solar arrays as well? And will there be pre-development studies done at control and development sites?
The answer to your question is yes, it will include looking at the solar array, not because that was part of the original study plan, but because I'm curious. And yes, it's a BACI designed study. We've done monitoring pre-construction, and we will be doing it throughout construction and operation.
Okay. And then have you have any cases of solar development or functional winter range for large mammals like elk and deer, pronghorn, have been maintained?
That's a challenge. That was in the site that we did in Oregon. That was a major issue because it is a big game wintering area. And basically the answer to that was to acquire additional land outside the fenced array that could be put into conservation easement so that it could be maintained as winter range, because the area within the panels really isn't used and they can't risk having big game animals moving around among the panels.
And that was actually one of the cases on the first large scale solar farm that was developed on Long Island that I was involved with. It was deliberately fenced to keep deer out, but openings provided in the fences for smaller wildlife. And we have had actually large mammals get into the fenced area and have actually damaged panels. All right, we are pretty much out of time. I do want to reiterate that we are going to have additional webinars. with the Renewable Energy Working Group. Check our website out on the TWS web pages, and we'll have our announcements of those at that time. Susan, you want to do any final remarks?
The only thing I would like to add is that, you know, the Renewable Energy Working Group, the Wildlife Society, is always looking for new membership, and we welcome you guys to join if you're TWS members. This is a great time to join this group because we're seeing lots of changes at the national level with the new administration that are going to have a focus on renewables. So it's a great time to be sure that we take care of our wildlife and other natural resources as we're moving forward with renewable energy advances.
Okay. All right. With that, we will close out, and thanks everybody for attending.